Hello and welcome to another conversation with MEMO. My name is Ahmed and I will be your host for today's discussion. We are reviewing a new book today, Canada as a Settler Colony on the Question of Palestine. Among its unique contributions, the volume provides a fresh look at Canada's foreign policy as informed that is informed and shaped by its own history of settler colonialism. I am joined by one of the co-editors of the book, Professor Muhannad Ayyash. Muhannad, thank you for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
So, Muhannad was born and raised in Silwan, Al-Quds, before emigrating to Canada, where he is now a professor of sociology at Mount Royal University. He is the author of several books and works, including Hermeneutics of Violence. There's another book, and also this latest work, which, as I said, is co-edited with Jeremy Wildman. So, Muhannad, let's begin by looking at the origins of the book before we dive into some of the key themes and arguments that are discussed by some of the 11 or so contributors to the volume. So let's just start with the origins of the book before we begin a deep dive discussion.
Yeah, so basically back in 2019, if I recall the year correctly, it's been a while, but I think it was in 2019, Jeremy and others had organized this symposium on the study of Palestine in Canada and brought in many scholars and activists and journalists and community members. And it was a wonderful symposium that led to several publications. And this book being one of them. So Jeremy had already kind of started working on this book with the authors that ended up appearing in the book, and reached out to me at some point in the process to see if I would be interested in co-editing, and I, of course, was happy to do it. And as we were reading the chapters and thinking through some of these questions, that's when it emerged to us that actually, framing this book as a contribution to our understanding of Canadian policy on Palestine through a settler colonial lens is really the important point of intervention here. So that's what we shared with our authors, and some were already doing that kind of analysis. Some weren't, and then started to include it more, and some didn't include it even in their chapters. But we thought that that was okay too, because it shows that even when you don't explicitly use the settler colonial lens, you can still speak to our understanding of these issues using that settler colonial framework. So that's kind of the origins of it, and it's been wonderful working with Jeremy on this book and the rest of the authors. That's for certain.
So what does it mean to look at Palestine through the lens of settler colonialism? And also, why is that important? I mean, what other lenses can you look at it through? I mean, some people probably say you can look at it through the lens of just occupation, international law. And what specifically is it about the lens of settler colonialism that you think is pertinent, and what defines some of the key features of looking at Palestine through the lens of settler colonialism?
Absolutely. So there are two different interventions here, right? So the first one is the understanding of the Palestinian struggle and Israeli occupation as settler colonial and Palestinian struggle as decolonial is really critical in illuminating the reality on the ground in Palestine. Other frameworks that have been used in the past is more of a viewing the Israeli project as a nationalist project, not a settler colonial one. I have critiqued these approaches quite extensively, including in my latest journal publications this year in Middle East Critique, where I argue that actually that is a misleading characterization of the Israeli project to call it a nationalist one. I don't even agree with the some critical scholars who say that it is both nationalist and settler colonial. No, it is settler colonial root and stem. Within that, there are elements of nationalism. Guess what? Just as there are in other settler colonial contexts. It's not like nationalism is absent in other settler colonial contexts. In fact, as scholars of nationalism, one of the main scholars of nationalism, Benedict Anderson, said as much back in 1994, is that modern nationalism actually arises in the settler colony, in the US, in Latin America. It's not an either or. You can have nationalism in the context, but the foundation of it is settler colonialism. And the reason why that's important in the case of Palestine is that that is the only way to really reveal the reality on the ground. And you cannot make changes unless you understand reality. So that's why it's critical to use a settler colonial lens in order to understand Israeli practices and the nature of the Israeli state, and to understand what it means for Palestinian liberation moving forward. The other side to this is Canadian settler colonialism. So the lens through which people have analyzed Canada's position on Palestine has been sort of your traditional, conventional understanding of international relations, where Canada is viewed ultimately as a modern democratic state that takes seriously the ideals of human rights, of the rule of law, of democracy, of alleviating human suffering, and so on. And then from that basis, they start to analyze how Canada's position fails to reach those ideals in regards to its policy position on Palestine. So the kind of subtext of that framework is to say that Canada more or less means, well, they just need to be better informed about what's happening in Palestine, and they should take better positions on Palestine. But what the settler colonial lens does is to say, actually, it's much more, the relations between Canada and Israel, and Canada's position, and the explanation for Canada's position on Palestine is much deeper than that. It's much more structural than that. That Canada, as a settler colony, never actually stood up for those ideals it proclaims to stand for. Just ask indigenous communities in the settler colony of Canada, and they'll tell you, the Canada we know never stood up for those ideals. It actually committed genocide against us, and continues to practice different forms of settler colonial genocide against the indigenous population in this country. So when you start to see that, you start to better understand why Canada's position on Palestine are indeed violent and racist. It's because the structures and the foundations of Canada as a settler colony are racist and violent. So that's the different lens it brings into a critical analysis of Canada on the question of Palestine.
But we'll get to some Canada's policy towards Israel in a minute, or Palestine. So now we're seeing a genocide unfold in front of our eyes, and last week we also saw another pogrom in the West Bank carried out by Israeli settlers. So how do these events, how are they better informed by looking at them through the lens of settler colonialism? What is it about settler colonialism that gives you a better understanding of the genocide that's taking place in Gaza and the ongoing pogroms that we see every week in the occupied West Bank?
Yeah, so the main defining feature of settler colonialism is that it is determined to eliminate the indigenous population, and critically eliminate indigenous forms of sovereignty. And then they replace them with settlers and with settler colonial sovereignty. So when you start to understand the Israeli state project as one that has to eliminate Palestinian sovereignty and expel and eliminate Palestinians from their lands and eliminate them politically, if not physically, then all of these things start to make sense to you. And you start to understand that what happened historically, for example, in 1948 Nakba, is not just some one-off event, but what scholars in the field of settler colonialism would call an ongoing structure of genocide and elimination. So that's how you make sense of the genocidal operation. You can't make sense of it by saying, oh, this is a security operation, or, oh, this is just, random release of violence, of state violence against a defenseless people. Well, it is that, but there's a goal behind it. The goal behind it is to empty the land of Palestinians so that then Israelis would colonize it, create exclusive Israeli Jewish sovereignty over the land and then populate it with Israeli Jews that then would make up the demographic majority in the entirety of the territory. And the Israeli state project is to create that exclusive Israeli Jewish sovereignty from the river to the sea. They want the whole thing. They've never accepted the idea of Palestinian sovereignty. They never accepted the idea of Palestinian self-determination. They wanted 100% of the land from the river to the sea to be under official exclusive Israeli Jewish sovereignty. And within that territory, there would be an overwhelming majority of Israeli Jews. And the Palestinians would make up at best, anywhere between 8% to 20% of the total population, but not more than that. So to achieve that, they undertake these genocidal operations that we're seeing in Gaza right now. They undertake pogroms, they undertake settlement expansion, they undertake home demolition, business demolitions, they undertake the checkpoints. They basically try to make life so impossible for Palestinians so that they all leave the land. So they tried, it's everything that Israel does is always geared towards removing Palestinians from the picture and replacing them with Israeli Jews. So once you understand that as the foundation of the Israeli state project, you start to make sense of all of these events, and you start to understand that they are part of that goal, ultimate goal of Zionism and Israel.
I can play devil's advocate for a bit and push back and say, many Zionists will say Israel is a state, is recognized by the UN, it's a member of the United Nations, has legitimacy. So in what way is a settler colony? Settler colony paradigms, they usually have a metropolis and a satellite. Israel does not have a metropolis. It's a national self-determination of the Jewish people. So this framing is incorrect. I mean, how would you push back against that?
Very easily, actually, because all of these are very weak talking points. So, you know who else is recognized by the United Nations and has legitimacy and all that? Canada. So does the US. So does every other, Australia. So does every other settler colony. So just being recognized in international law and by other states around the world doesn't mean that you're not a settler colony. You are still a settler colony. You can be both. Moreover, this whole point about the home metropolis and the colony and all of that, without imperial support from the British Empire and now the US Empire, Israel cannot exist. So they do have that support from the imperial center. And just as there were tensions between the home country and the settler colony in those other cases, there is one now between Israel and back then the British Empire and now the US. They're all the same tensions that we've seen in the past. So for instance, the US is a settler colony that comes out of British settler colonialism, right? But they fought a war against the British Empire to gain their independence, but that still makes them a settler colony. That still means, my point is that the tension is so strong between the US settler colony and British Empire is that they actually fought a war at some point. We haven't even seen that level of tension yet between Israel and the US. The Israelis, or the Israeli settler colonial project, though it did not have a home metropole in the same sense, it still has the same fundamental relation that makes possible the creation of the settler colony. And the British Empire saw the creation of Israeli settler colonial outposts in the region as beneficial for the same reason that they saw other settler colonial outposts benefit for them. It would help them control and dominate that region, exploit its resources, exploit the people of the region, and so on and so forth. So the British Empire's support for the Zionist project was based on its own self-interest, which basically were twofold. One, they didn't want European Jews from Central and Eastern Europe migrating into Western Europe, and specifically the UK, because they are foundationally anti-Semitic. That's the real anti-Semitism. And two, they saw it as a critical imperial outpost that would help them solidify their interest in the region. The thinking is basically simple. If there's a European-style state in the region that depends on its existence and survival on British imperial power, then it's going to be loyal to British imperial power, and it's going to help advance British imperial power. the same calculation still applies, albeit in different ways, with the US empire, which starts to see Israel as a critical asset starting in the Cold War. During the Cold War, the US starts to see Israel as very useful in its struggle against communism, which was really not a struggle against communism, but more an attempt to spread neoliberal politics across the world so that it would benefit the American empire at the expense of people around the world. And that's when that relationship started to advance and take hold. And now it became so strong, it survived the end of the Cold War because the US still needs an imperial outpost in the region to secure its interests and to advance the spread of neoliberal political economy across the world. And not just in the region, but elsewhere. The Israelis helped the Americans advance neoliberal economics and political economy in Central America and South America, right? Who funded and trained those fascist regimes in those places? Israel. On behest of the Americans. So they still play a critical role for them, and that's where the relationship still lies. So the Zionist project is settler-colonial root and stem in the same way that you find in other settler-colonial projects. And by the way, there are of course going to be differences. No systems of power look the same exactly everywhere. Neoliberalism and capitalism look a certain way in Norway and they look a different way in the US, but we still use the same term to describe both, but we understand that there's comparison to be made. So of course, there's comparisons to be made between Israeli settler colonialism versus settler colonialism in Australia versus in Canada and so on. Like, that's good comparative work, but it doesn't take it outside of the settler colonial framework.
No, that's a really good explanation. And I think one thing that was clear to me when I was reading the book is the idea that, it's very difficult to jettison the features of settler colonialism if the country is founded with the origins of the country is settler colonialism, like the US, like Canada. It's also very difficult for a country to move beyond a post-settler colonial phase, and if it is able to do so, it's still support for countries is very much dependent on some of the values and ethics that underpin settler colonialism, and Canada is an example of that. So can you just go through some of the policies of Canada which actually is motivated by its history of settler colonialism that is now playing out in the way Canada is providing aid and support to Israel, not to mention the way it's basically backing the current genocide in Gaza?
Absolutely. So first things first. A settler colony cannot become something other than a settler colony unless there's true decolonization. So the settler colonial foundations, that's why they remain active and animate the policies of the settler colony until the moment of decolonization, which has not come in Canada, has not come in the US, and certainly is far, far from coming in Israel. Because Israel is still in the sort of the mid, as far as they see it, the middle stages of their settler colonial conquest of Palestine. There's still a lot of Palestinians to eliminate and expel before they achieve their ultimate goal of Greater Israel. So how does it look like in a place like Canada? Well, first of all, it looks like continuing settler colonial violence against indigenous communities. So Canada doesn't tire of telling the world about its truth and reconciliation efforts and how it takes seriously indigenous peoples and wants to do right by them and all of those sorts of things. But that is all hot talk that doesn't actually have much basis in reality. There's not one Canadian politician that I know of. Maybe you can find one or two, but the absolute 99% of Canadian politicians across the political spectrum, I don't hear them talking about indigenous sovereignty. I don't like that's always the red line that cannot be crossed in a settler colony. That's why it remains a settler colony until the moment of decolonization. Because again, we go back to one of the defining features of settler colonialism is the elimination of indigenous sovereignty. The idea that indigenous people get to remain as a sovereign people who make their own laws and their own systems of governance and their own political and economic structures and so on. That is a no-go zone for Canadian politics. It's completely off the books, out of the realm of possibility. So anytime Indigenous people and communities in Canada want to say, well, I don't want this, let's say, pipeline to go through our communities, the Canadian government will be quick to crush them and do whatever it needs to do to get what it wants done with the resources of the land. So there's no respect whatsoever for Indigenous people as sovereign people. The treaties that they signed with the Crown, they never gave up their sovereignty in those treaties. So they're still insisting on their sovereignty, as they should. So that's how those policies then end up playing out here. And then you see that as well in a number of ways, whether the criminal justice system, child care services, education, access to resources, access to clean water, and so on. Healthcare, in all of those ways, you'll see Canadian policies being still settler colonial, still eliminatory of Indigenous sovereignty. Now, those values are based on the idea that the Indigenous people of the land were backward, ultimately backward, uncivilized, undeveloped, and so on, an inferior race of people that would be welcomed into Canadian society so long as they become like the Canadian civilized structure, and they basically become like the European white races. Some say that part out loudly. Most have more clever ways of saying the same thing. And then that form of thinking shows up continuously in the case of Palestine. Look at how many Canadian politicians speak to the actual aspirations of the Palestinian people. I can count them on one hand. It's not that many that will actually listen to Palestinians as people who have an ability to understand their own plight and an ability to speak out their aspirations for freedom and liberation and an ability to say that we want to live a sovereign, free life. None of that enters the discourse of the overwhelming majority of politicians and certainly policy. It doesn't enter the policy discourse in Canada. So Canada will say things like, oh, we support a two-state solution. Okay. Well, Israel clearly doesn't. I mean, they've dropped all pretensions now. They just passed, a resolution or a motion, I can't remember what they called it in the Knesset, that said they will never recognize the Palestinian state and that the Palestinian state is an existential danger to Israel. Netanyahu continuously says there will never be a Palestinian state on my watch, and he talks very openly about the creation of greater Israel. Policies-wise, you can see the expansion of settlements. You can see how Israel is continuously creating facts on the ground that make it impossible to follow a two-state solution. You can see that they think Jerusalem is their undivided capital, and so on. The list is quite huge. So it's obvious that when Canada says we support a two-state solution, that it's just doing empty talks and gestures, and that no politician seriously takes into account that Israel does not want this, and therefore the Palestinian aspirations for freedom and liberation will continue to be denied. So that tells you that they don't take that seriously because they ultimately view them the same way they view Indigenous people here, as lesser race of people that don't really matter, whose aspirations can be completely ignored, marginalized, censored, stepped over for the benefit of their own colonial and imperial interests. So you see the same trend in other spheres as well, but certainly on the question of Palestine, you see the same worldview that they have of Indigenous people here replicated on the international stage in regards to the Palestinians.
I think we'll end with a discussion on what a decolonized Canadian policy towards Palestine may look like. But before we do that, I wanted to just dive into some of the articles, essays in the book. I think there's 11 or so essays. I mean, is there any particular one that resonates with you that really explains well how we can better understand the situation on the ground, whether it be the genocide in Gaza or the pogroms in the West Bank? And also, two I want to mention specifically is one about how Canada is suppressing pro-Palestinian activism. Can you comment on that? And also how, as an article by page, I think chapter 3, looking at the role of Canada in displacing Palestinian refugees. So I know there's 3 questions there. So first, how does Canada play a role in the displacement of Palestinian refugees? How does Canada suppress pro-Palestinian activism? And is there one particular essay that you want to speak about and highlight?
Well, it's difficult to do the one essay to or one
Yeah,
chapter to highlight. I don't feel that that would be fair to anyone. So I recommend people check out all of them, and each one provides you with a different area of analysis and a different angle. So there's analysis of the media, analysis of policy, analysis of discourse, analysis of what it's like for Palestinians to inhabit a place like Canada. So it's just there's different. They're all providing different aspects. So I don't know if I can pick one essay that best speaks to this. I think the book
fair
as
enough.
a whole best speaks to what we're talking about. Um, uh, uh, um, but I think the critical point for people to take away from the book is that Canada is not just some neutral actor that is just trying to help and that is a force of good ultimately in the world. That's how Canada likes to paint itself. And what each chapter in the book gives you is a picture of how not only does it fail to achieve that, because there's just a mistake here and there in the policy, how it's written, and it could be different, but written differently, and everything will be good, or the implementation just didn't work out so well. It's not those issues. So those issues can be applicable in other policy areas. I don't deny that could be a thing in other policy areas, right? But in this specific policy area, the main issue is that Canada is not interested in Palestinian freedom and liberation, and does not view that as a priority or even a goal in its policy position on Palestine. And ultimately, what Canada does is not just not help, it actually actively participates in the colonization of Palestine through its support for Israel, through its policies that give the appearance of helping Palestinians, but is in fact just solidifying Israeli settler colonialism. And some of those details again are spelled out in the chapters. So that's, I think, the most important point is that it shows Canada as an active participation in the denial of the Palestinian right to freedom and sovereignty and self-determination. And so what needs to happen is a fundamental change in the settler colonial structures of the Canadian state. This is why I argue in my essay that the reason why I think Palestinians in the settler colony of Canada should actually prioritize their relations with Indigenous people is because our liberation is tied with theirs. Decolonization in Canada can only help decolonization in Palestine and vice versa. So I don't have too much faith or hope in the political process that we currently have in Canada as the place where change can happen. I have more hope in grassroots pressure affecting that political process and redirecting it towards a different path. It's not easy, it's not simple, and I know we'll touch on that at the end, but there's no electoral path to fundamentally transforming Canada in a healthy way towards a better position on Palestine and a better position and better positions and policies on Indigenous settler relations here. But sorry, what was the third part of your question?
I think if I can refine, I'll
Yeah.
rephrase that question. So there is an article in the book by one of the authors by Mira Sukrov, who discusses the influence of the Israeli lobby in Canada. And the question about the lobby, Israeli lobby, Zionist lobby, whatever you want to call it, has become quite pertinent since 7 October in the US. As the connection between APEC and US foreign policy, how many will argue that America has been forced to fight a number of wars on behalf of Israel. So you could almost go into conspiratorial, angle with that. But what you're saying, or the argument that's been made in the book, is that it's not just the lobby, Israeli lobby. There's something fundamental about the nature of the US, the nature of Canada, which automatically aligns them because they themselves are settler colonial project. It doesn't require a Zionist lobby, although the Zionist lobby, has its own agenda. It doesn't require those lobbies for America or Canada or any other settler colonial country to find automatic empathy towards another settler colonial project like Israel. Am I right in saying that?
Yes, but okay, so let me sort of delve a bit deeper into some of that, which is not present in Mira's chapter. She has a very different take and doesn't really adopt the settler colonial framework, but we thought that that chapter was good in terms of speaking to the role of the lobby in Canada in suppressing pro-Palestinian solidarity work. And that's the other point that you asked earlier that I'll come back to as well. Because it is tied to the lobby as well. So this is how I argue we should view the role of the lobby in a forthcoming journal article that I have coming up in October. I think it will be published. So as you rightly pointed out, I think the idea that the pro-Israel lobby is the reason why America is dragged into these wars that it doesn't want to do and just innocently was fooled by the lobby into doing. I mean, it's not just conspiratorial, but I'm sorry, naive. The Americans are not stupid. The Canadians are not stupid, nor are they naive. They don't do things, especially things like war, because they don't think it's in their interests. Of course they do it because it's in their interests. Now, what happened during the Cold War, especially in the US, and I'll focus a little bit more on the US because that's the more important player. Canada just basically does what the US tells it to do on this question as well. Is that there were debates within the American administration. Well, look, we have good ties with some of these Arab regimes, what I would call post-colonial authoritarian regimes that don't really represent the interests of their own people, but only themselves and the economic and political elites who get the crumbs of empire by aligning themselves with the American empire. So some within the American administration were saying, or foreign policy circles were saying, well, we have good relations with those regimes. We can achieve our aims, our imperial aims. They don't call it imperialism, but national interest, quote unquote, but it's their imperial aims through those regimes. Why do we have this headache called Israel that we'll still support to exist, but why would we give it an unconditional support to get what we can get through those other regimes? It's much less volatile to do it with the Arab regimes than with a settler colony. And though they don't call it a settler colony, they all know that it's an invasion in the land, right? That it's a foreign power coming in to occupy the Arab land. The Israel lobby comes up to really defeat that line of thinking. That's the line of thinking that Israel views as really threatening to it, as they should view it that way. Because if that line of thinking takes hold in the US, it's possible the US drops its support for Israel because it will view it as too costly. Remember earlier when I said there's always a tension between the settler colony and the empire? This is precisely that tension that has appeared in other cases. So the US could at some point, for example, make the calculation that this imperial outpost, it has served us well, but right now the costs of it are too high for us. And therefore, let's go another path. If they do that, that could begin a slow process of ending support for Israel. That wouldn't happen right away, by the way, but it would be slow. And without that, the Israeli settler colonial project would not be able to stand. It cannot survive without imperial support. So that's where the lobby comes in. So now the lobby is basically saying to prevent this line of thinking from emerging in foreign policy circles, we have to stop any serious critique of Israel. Because if then there's critiques of Israel coming from the right and the left, by the way, if there's any critique that becomes dominant, that becomes another reason to push oh, this is too much of a headache for us line of thinking. So they attack any speech that expresses solidarity with Palestinians, any critique that reveals the reality on the ground, And they do that by weaponizing anti-Semitism. So that's when you start to see the emergence of this concept of new anti-Semitism. It happens in and around the same time as the US-Israel relationship is growing in the Cold War in the 1960s, 1970s, and you start to see this weaponization of anti-Semitism take hold. It's now developed into a full-fledged strategy funded and supported by the Israeli state through things like the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism and other such efforts, where everything is called anti-Semitism, everything related to serious critiques of Israel, anything that basically reveals the reality of Israel as settler-colonial, as apartheid, as brutal, as committing war crimes, as committing genocide, anything that does that will be called anti-Semitic in order to stop it from spreading and stop this line of Israel as a strategic liability doctrine from re-emerging and taking hold in American foreign policy circles and Canadian foreign policy circles. So, one of the ways that you see how this transpires, by the way, I'll mention an example of Canada. So this happened a few years ago. I shouldn't say a few. I think it was 2 or 3 years ago, where a former high-ranking member of the Liberal Party, who's retired now, and former, held ministerial positions, was involved in foreign policy and all of that, gave a talk, and it was to a group of Muslim community members and activists. So he felt that he could speak a little more freely in that setting, and said something along the line of, well, on the question of Palestine, I can tell you, in my view, Canada has little to lose in terms of its direct relationship with Israel. In terms of whether you're talking about economic trade or sales of weapons and all that, it's there, but it's not that big of a deal for Canada. That's what his assessment was. That if it lost that, it could just find other partners to make up that amount. But the reason it doesn't happen, he focused on, well, electorally, the Liberal Party thinks that would be a disaster in certain important ridings, that their calculation is that they wouldn't win elections if they did that. The other part that he didn't mention, of course, because he has to present Canada as an independent sovereign nation, of course, is that the Canadians would be terrified of what that would mean with their relationship with the US. They wouldn't want to upset the US that strongly by doing that. So all of those factors come in, but in addition to that, what he also doesn't say that is important is that foundational shared worldview of settler colonialism. So I think it's those really 3 levels that one has to look at when they're understanding why Canada's position is the way it is, and what precisely is the role of the pro-Israel lobby within that picture, which is to continue to prevent the emergence of the Israel as a strategic liability doctrine, and to help eliminate the existence of Palestinians as a political entity, right? Like, so Israel also views that as a threat to itself. The idea that Palestinians in places like Canada, the places to which they were expelled, the US, Canada, other parts of the UK, other parts of the world, that they continue to hold on to the right of return and right to sovereign existence on their lands, and to exist as Palestinians, as a political identity called Palestinians. That it's part of the settler-colonial project to also eliminate that anywhere it finds it in the world. So that's also part of the lobby's job. So when you combine all these factors, you start to see why things look the way that they look, and how a genocide can unfold in front of everyone's eyes, while the people around the world, I think the majority of people around the world want it to stop, it still doesn't stop, because there are all these very strong, powerful structures that believe they have too much to lose in terms of power and wealth by stopping the genocide of the Palestinian people.
Let's end with this question about decolonization. We spoke a lot about the Israeli lobby and its role in stopping the narrative that Israel is a strategic liability. And you can see that clearly as Israel's rapacious violence goes up, you see crackdown also go up, and the lobby kicks into gear and new laws are introduced. So you see that quite clearly. But the idea that Israel is a strategic liability is penetrating into spaces never did before. You see that quite clearly on social media. Some of it, of course, takes a conspiratorial path, but generally, by and large, I see that people are asking questions. What does Israel have to give to us? And then you see the pro-Israeli side making bombastic statements, especially from the far right, saying things like, if Israel falls, the West will fall. So we have to protect Israel no matter what. So you get these crazy, statements from people like Murray and Douglas Murray, UK commentator, and others. But so there seems to be the first signs of an understanding that Israel is a strategic liability, and I think Canada is also asking questions about its own history, colonial history, and there is a sense that they have to decolonize. There needs to be peace and reconciliation. Probably had something similar in Australia. So the question is, I mean, is that process growing, especially given that we are seeing what Zionism looks like in its true form, if we can, because that genocide is the true form of every ethno-nationalist state. That is the true form, and that's been proven clearly now. So is Canada going through a reconciliation phase, and what would a post-colonial Canadian policy towards Palestine look like? I mean, I think we can end on that.
Absolutely. Okay. So one of the I think promising developments that is happening in Canada is increasing Indigenous Palestinian solidarities on the grassroots level. So you do see a lot more awareness in Palestinian communities in Canada about Indigenous issues. And you're seeing more awareness by some Indigenous communities as well about the Palestine issue. It's happening slowly. It's not where activists would like to see it, but there are increasing solidarities forming. And I think that's a healthy thing. That's a good thing, because that can create grassroots pressure in the long term to start to pressure institutions in Canada, not just to change their position on Palestine, but to take more seriously decolonization within the settler colony of Canada. Now, what does that look like in terms of decolonization in Canada? That's best answered by Indigenous communities and activists, and that's a lively debate that happens within those communities continuously. In my humble view, and based on my conversations with Indigenous scholars and activists, is that it has to have the re-emergence of Indigenous sovereignty. And I would argue that the idea of shared sovereignty, which I'm writing about in a new book, is a path towards that. That this notion of exclusive sovereignty of one race or one nationality, however you want to define it, over a territory is a relatively new idea, probably just a couple of 100, 300, 500 at most years old. It's a destructive idea. It's a terrible idea. There are better ways of practicing sovereignty than that, shared sovereignty being one of them. And I think the advancement of shared sovereignty across the settler colony of Canada and in Palestine would be the commencement of a new way of sharing land and sharing sovereignty that would be healthier for everyone. But in the sort of more immediate question of what does it look like for Canada to take a more decolonial position on Palestine, it's simple. Cut off all ties with the Israeli state. Let's start with a full embargo, weapons embargo. And not the fake one that Canada did back in the winter, which is entirely meaningless. But a full actual embargo on weapons, 2 ways, permanent until Israeli settler colonialism is stopped, and the Palestinian rights, including the right of return for all Palestinian refugees, including those expelled in 1948, is addressed and recognized, and we can take it from there. But there's no real position that any state can take on this unless it is complete isolation of Israel. Because when you look at the situation, it's not that complicated. Israel goes, well, I'm getting away with everything. People have recognized the land I conquered in 1948, so I got away with it then. Why couldn't I get away with it now? Sure, there's a rough patch that I'm running through right now, and my image is down the drain, but I can rehabilitate that, and my power and my force will gain me what I want, which is full official Israeli Jewish sovereignty over a whole land. That's what they're thinking. So the only way to get a power off that path, there's only two. You go to war with it, or you isolate it economically and politically. So I prefer the path of economic and political isolation. War is a very violent thing, very destructive thing. In such a war, thousands and thousands would die. Nobody knows what the outcome would be. It's not a good path for a variety of these reasons, not just moral and ethical, but strategic as well. The path of economic and political isolation and legal repercussions for their path, that can produce results much quicker, by the way, than a war does, and a much healthier way that can lead us to actually transforming political, economic, and legal structures. So everyone knows that that is what is needed. So unless a state takes that position, it's not taking a decolonial position. So it has to take that position. And Canada is included on that. Now, do I think that that's happening around the corner? No. Do I think Canada will be the first state to do that? Hell no. But we have to continue to pressure Canada and calling them out. Okay, unless you take that position, then you are racist and violent. It's that simple. And you are participating in empire, and you are showing that you are committed to set your own settler-colonial foundations and roots and continuing that settler-colonial project on Turtle Island. So I don't know any other way than calling out what I see. And continuing to hope that grassroots pressure continues to build, and that would force these kinds of transformations. But that would be the only way to do it, is to isolate the Israeli state economically, politically, make them pay material consequences for their actions. Otherwise, they will continue to do them.
Thank you, Muhammad. That was fascinating. So this was a conversation between me, Nasim Ahmed, and Professor Muhannad Ayyash, reviewing his new book, Canada as a Settler Colony, on the question of Palestine. I read a PDF copy. Do you have? I don't have a hard copy. Do you have a hard copy? You want to? Where can they?
I don't have it with me,
Oh,
actually.
that's fine. That's fine. So I'm
I gave
assuming you
away
can buy
all
it
my
from.
3 copies, but I have
Yeah.
one. I have one left.
So
But it's
available in all bookshops. But thank you so much, Muhannad. It was a really fantastic conversation. Thank you.
my pleasure. Thank you so
And
much.
thank you also for tuning in. See you for another conversation with the Middle East Monitor. Bye-bye.